Imagine standing in the shadows of a towering temple, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs, as a priestess utters words that will determine the fate of empires. This wasn't just ceremony, it was psychological warfare. The Oracle of Delphi, revered as the mouthpiece of the gods, held sway over kings and generals, her cryptic prophecies nudging history toward outcomes that benefited a select few. But here's the unsettling truth. Many of these so-called divine messages were carefully crafted illusions, designed to manipulate masses and steer the course of civilizations. What if the most pivotal moments in ancient history, wars waged, cities founded, dynasties toppled, were not guided by the gods but by the hidden hands of those who understood the power of prophecy as a tool of control? The echoes of this ancient manipulation still resonate today. Think about how information shapes our modern world, how a single headline or viral rumor can alter public opinion, ignite movements, or even sway elections. The mechanics haven't changed, only the medium has. 2,000 years ago, it was priests and rulers weaving prophecies to serve their agendas. Today, it's algorithms and influencers. The parallels are eerie, revealing a timeless truth. Those who control the narrative control the future. But how did ancient elites engineer prophecies so convincingly that entire generations believed they were divine? Who were the architects behind these schemes, and what tricks did they use to make their fabrications feel like absolute truth? This is the story we're unraveling, a journey through the hidden corridors of history where myth and manipulation collide. We'll dissect the psychological playbook of ancient prophecy makers, from the calculated ambiguity of their words to the theatrical rituals that lent them credibility. You'll see how temples doubled as propaganda centers, how miracles were staged, and how fear and hope were harnessed to keep societies obedient. By the end, you'll never look at history or the stories shaping our world today the same way again. Because the greatest trick the ancients ever pulled wasn't just convincing people the gods spoke through them, it was making us forget that humans wrote the script all along. Prophecies in the ancient world weren't just whispers from the gods, they were the ultimate political weapon. Picture a king facing rebellion or a city on the brink of famine. In moments of crisis, rulers didn't turn to generals or economists first. They rushed to oracles, those sacred intermediaries who could spin chaos into order with a few well-placed words. Take the Sibylline books in Rome, guarded like state secrets and consulted only when disaster loomed. Their verses, deliberately vague, became a divine rubber stamp for whatever the Senate already wanted to do. Need to justify a costly war, the prophecy foretold it. Time to purge a rival, the gods had demanded it. The beauty of the system was its flexibility. Elites could twist the message to fit any agenda, all while the public believed they were following a celestial blueprint. But how did these prophecies gain such unshakable authority? The answer lies in a carefully orchestrated blend of psychology and theater. Oracles didn't just deliver messages, they performed them. At Delphi, the Pythia breathed hallucinogenic vapors, writhing in a trance to sell the illusion of divine possession. Temples were built in remote, awe-inspiring locations, places where the very air seemed charged with mystery. And the prophecies themselves, masterpieces of ambiguity. A classic example, when King Croesus of Lydia asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle replied, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." He assumed it meant Persia. It didn't. His own kingdom crumbled, yet the oracle's reputation remained untarnished. After all, the prophecy had been right, just not in the way he'd hoped. This wasn't accident, it was design. Ancient power brokers understood something profound. People crave certainty, especially in uncertain times. By packaging political decisions as divine will, they bypassed doubt and dissent. A farmer might question a tax hike from a king, but who argues with a god? The real genius was in the delivery, rituals so elaborate they left no room for skepticism. Animal sacrifices, sacred lots, ecstatic dances, every detail reinforced the idea that these messages came from a realm beyond human tampering, and if a prophecy failed. The interpreters claimed it had been misunderstood, or that the people hadn't shown enough faith. The system was rigged from the start, a self-correcting machine that kept the powerful in power and the masses obedient. Yet the most chilling part isn't how these prophecies were made, it's how eagerly they were believed. Ancient societies didn't just tolerate this manipulation, they demanded it. In a world where floods, plagues, and invasions seemed like cosmic punishments, people needed to believe someone, somewhere, could read the gods' intentions. That desperation made them perfect targets, and here's the twist, we're not so different today. Swap temple incense for trending hashtags, oracles for influencers, and the Sibylline books for viral conspiracy theories. The tools have modernized, but the game remains the same. Whoever controls the story controls the crowd. The ancients just wrote the playbook. Ambiguity was the ancient prophet's greatest ally, a linguistic trapdoor that allowed them to escape blame while maintaining an aura of infallibility. Take that infamous prophecy given to King Croesus. If you cross the river, a great empire will fall. At first glance, it sounds like a guarantee of victory. But the oracle never specified which empire. The phrasing was a masterclass in doublespeak, designed to be reinterpreted after the fact. When Croesus's forces were crushed, the priests at Delphi didn't miss a beat. The prophecy had been accurate all along. They insisted, just not in the way the king assumed. This wasn't a mistake. It was the system working as intended. The trick lay in the deliberate use of poetic language. Ancient prophecies were often couched in metaphors, riddles, or conditional statements that could bend to fit reality, no matter how events unfolded. The Oracle of Dodona, for example, specialized in prophecies so cryptic they required teams of interpreters, a built-in layer of deniability. If a prediction failed, the blame could always be shifted to human error in decoding the god's will. It's no accident that these oracles favored phrases like, "the oak tree will whisper," or "the bronze shield will tremble." Vague imagery created a Rorschach test for believers, allowing them to project their own hopes or fears onto the message. Fast forward to today, and you'll spot the same tactics in modern spin doctoring. Politicians speak of alternative facts or measured responses, phrases elastic enough to justify any outcome. Corporate PR teams bury risks in fine print with clauses like, "results may vary." Even weather forecasters hedge with "a chance of rain," language that's technically accurate, whether it drizzles or pours. The parallels are uncanny because the goal remains identical, to never be caught in a lie. The ancients just dressed it up in divine theater, but ambiguity alone wasn't enough to sustain the illusion. What gave these prophecies their teeth was the aura of secrecy surrounding them. Oracles didn't operate in the open. Their rituals were shrouded in darkness, their messages delivered through intermediaries who claimed exclusive access to the divine. This deliberate mystification made questioning the prophecies feel like blasphemy. After all, how could an ordinary farmer argue with a priest who'd communed with the gods in a smoke-filled sanctum? The less people understood the mechanics, the more powerful the illusion became. And that's where the real manipulation began, not in the words themselves, but in the carefully constructed mystique that made those words untouchable. The next layer of the scheme was even more ingenious, the use of fear and reward to cement belief. Oracles didn't just predict the future, they offered a bargain. Follow the prophecy and your crops would flourish. Ignore it and plagues would follow. This carrot-and-stick approach transformed vague words into self-fulfilling tools of control. When the Athenian oracle warned of wooden walls saving the city, it was the politician Themistocles who spun it as a call to build a navy, a move that secured his power and proved the prophecy right. The message didn't dictate the outcome. It provided a canvas for those in charge to paint their own version of events. What made this system so durable was its circular logic. Successful prophecies were celebrated as proof of divine power. Failed ones, they were either forgotten or rebranded as tests of faith. The priests of Apollo didn't keep records of their mistakes. They curated a highlight reel of hits, reinforcing the myth of their accuracy over generations. It's a tactic still used today. Think of how financial gurus promote their winning stock picks while quietly burying their losses. The ancients simply understood one universal truth. Certainty is a story we tell ourselves, and whoever controls the narrative controls the crowd. Now imagine the power this gave to the keepers of prophecy. They weren't just interpreters, they were the gatekeepers of reality itself, shaping decisions that echoed across kingdoms. And their greatest weapon wasn't the words they spoke, it was the silence they imposed on doubt. Because when people believe the gods are speaking, who dares to ask who's really writing the script? The temples of antiquity weren't just houses of worship, they were fortresses of knowledge, carefully designed to keep divine insight under lock and key. Think of it like an exclusive club where the price of admission wasn't gold but blind faith. Take the Pythia at Delphi, the most famous oracle of the ancient world. She didn't just stroll into town and start dispensing wisdom. No, seekers had to navigate a gauntlet of rituals, sacrifices, purification ceremonies, even waiting in line for days, all to ask a single question. And the answer, delivered in a drug-induced trance, slurred and fragmented, forcing the petitioner to rely on priests to translate the god's will. This wasn't spiritual guidance, it was a calculated bottleneck, ensuring only the approved message reached the public. The Egyptians took it further with dream incubations, where priests controlled who could receive divine visions. A petitioner would sleep in a sacred chamber, surrounded by chanting and incense, only to wake with a dream they believed was prophetic. But here's the catch, the priests alone decided what those dreams meant. Need to justify a tax hike, Pharaoh's vision commanded it, want to silence dissent. The gods had warned against rebellion in a nobleman's dream. The system was airtight because who could argue with someone else's subconscious? Then there were the Eleusinian mysteries, the ancient world's best-kept secret. For over 1,000 years, initiates underwent elaborate rites, swearing never to reveal what they'd seen. Those who broke the oath faced execution. What was so dangerous about a religious ritual? Nothing unless you consider that the real secret was the power it gave the priesthood. By monopolizing access to the divine, they turned spirituality into a hierarchy. The message was clear, the gods spoke only through us and only to those we allow. Sound familiar? Today's gatekeepers might not wear linen robes or burn sacred herbs, but the playbook hasn't changed. Consider how algorithms curate our news feeds, or how exclusive briefings shape public perception. The mediums have evolved, but the mechanism is the same. Control the flow of information, and you control the narrative. The ancients just had a flair for drama. They understood that mystery breeds authority, that the less people know about how the sausage is made, the more they'll believe it's divine. And that's the true genius of these systems. It wasn't just about keeping secrets, It was about making people want to be kept in the dark, because when the truth feels out of reach, we'll cling to whoever claims to hold the key. Whether it's a priest interpreting the rustle of oak leaves or a pundit decoding geopolitical tea leaves, the result is the same: power dressed up as prophecy. The only difference, we no longer call it the will of the gods, we call it the algorithm. If prophecies were the script, then miracles were the special effects, the dazzling spectacle that made the divine feel tangible. Consider Alexander the Great's encounter with the Gordian knot, a tangled mess of ropes said to bind the fate of Asia. The prophecy claimed whoever untied it would rule the continent. But Alexander never won for patience, simply sliced it with his sword. His spin doctors quickly rebranded the act not as defiance, but as destiny. The gods had meant for him to untie it unconventionally. Overnight, a staged moment became proof of divine favor, cementing his legitimacy as conqueror. This wasn't just clever PR, it was prophecy as theater, where the illusion of miracle mattered more than the miracle itself. Then there were the Romans, masters of rebranding chaos as celestial messaging. When a comet streaked across the sky after Julius Caesar's murder, his allies declared it his soul ascending to the gods, a sign endorsing his heir, Augustus. Never mind that comets were regular astronomical events. What mattered was the narrative. By framing natural phenomena as omens, elites could steer public sentiment without lifting a sword. Earthquakes became divine warnings, eclipses the gods' displeasure. Even a flock of birds could be spun as a portent, depending on who needed the story to fit. The real magic trick, though, lay in the staging. Priests in Egypt would rig temple statues with hidden levers, making them weep or speak to awed crowds. In Greece, hidden tunnels allowed apparitions to appear during rituals. These weren't just parlor tricks, they were psychological operations designed to weaponize wonder. Because when people believe they've witnessed the impossible, they stop questioning the improbable. Fear was the final ingredient in this alchemy of control. A prophecy about coming doom was useless unless it terrified people into compliance. That's why oracles paired their visions with expiration dates. The gods will unleash famine unless you pay the temple tithe. It was divine extortion, leveraging dread to ensure obedience. The Athenian plague of 430 BCE, for example, was blamed on sacrilege, a convenient scapegoat for leaders who'd failed to contain the disease. By the time the bodies piled up, no one dared doubt the priest's warnings. What's chilling is how little separates ancient omens from modern fear-mongering. Swap comet sightings for climate disaster headlines or temple prophecies for doom-laden political ads. The tools change, but the calculus remains. Frighten people enough, and they'll hand over power to anyone claiming to hold the solution. The ancients just had better costumes. Fear was the fertilizer that made prophecies grow, a truth ancient rulers knew all too well. When the Persian Empire marched toward Athens in 480 BCE, the city was gripped by panic. The Delphic Oracle saw an opportunity. Its priests delivered a chilling prophecy: only the wooden walls will save you. At face value, it sounded like a death sentence. But Athenian leaders, desperate for hope, spun it as divine strategy. Themistocles convinced the people the walls meant ships, launching a naval buildup that ultimately defeated Persia at Salamis. The brilliance of this manipulation, the oracle never specified what the walls were. The ambiguity allowed leaders to mold public fear into action while claiming heavenly endorsement. This wasn't guidance, it was gaslighting on a civilization-wide scale. Plagues were another golden ticket for prophecy peddlers. When disease ravaged Athens in 430 BCE, priests blamed it on the desecration of sacred statues. Never mind the overcrowded streets or lack of sanitation. The real culprit, they claimed, was divine wrath. The solution, costly rituals and temple donations, of course. It's no coincidence that miraculous recoveries often followed these payments. The pattern was textbook: manufacture crisis, sell salvation, repeat. And it worked because terrified people don't ask for receipts, they beg for lifelines. Modern parallels leap from the history books. During the 2020 pandemic, wild theories about divine punishments spread as fast as the virus itself. Conspiracy gurus replaced oracle priests hawking silver bullets, from unproven medicines to bizarre rituals, to an anxious public. The mechanism is identical: exploit uncertainty, then position yourself as the gatekeeper of safety. Whether it's 4th century BCE priests blaming sickness on offended gods or 21st century influencers peddling miracle cures, the playbook hasn't changed. Crisis doesn't just create believers, it creates markets. But the most insidious trick was tailoring prophecies to specific audiences. Roman generals received promises of victory before battle, while peasants got warnings about crop failures unless they tithed more. This wasn't one-size-fits-all divination, it was precision-engineered messaging. The Sibylline books even had different editions for patricians and plebeians. Today's echo chambers operate the same way. Algorithms feed us personalized doom scrolls, climate catastrophe for some, economic collapse for others. The delivery method evolved from smoke-filled temples to glowing screens, but the goal remains: keep people scared enough to stay dependent on whoever claims to hold the answers. What made these fear-based prophecies stick wasn't just their timing, but their packaging. Ancient manipulators wrapped dire warnings in layers of spectacle: earthquakes interpreted as angry gods, eclipses as cosmic disapproval. When nature itself seemed to endorse the narrative, who could argue? Modern fear-mongers use similar theatrics, repackaging weather events as signs of the end times or economic shifts as systemic collapse. The props change, but the performance is eternal. Because when the world feels unstable, people will trade critical thinking for the illusion of control, whether offered by a trembling oracle or a trending tweet. And that reveals the darkest irony of engineered prophecy. It doesn't just predict chaos, it creates it. By convincing societies that every disaster is divine retribution or hidden conspiracy, the manipulators ensure we're always braced for the next catastrophe, always looking for someone to interpret the signs. The real prophecy, a self-fulfilling cycle of dread that keeps the gears of control turning, because a population waiting for the sky to fall will never notice the strings being pulled right in front of them. Prophecies didn't come one-size-fits-all in the ancient world. They were custom-tailored to fit the cultural wardrobe of every society they sought to control. Think of it like a spiritual marketing campaign where the message was tweaked to resonate with local beliefs, fears, and symbols. In Mesopotamia, where the stars were considered the gods' handwriting, prophecies came stamped with celestial authority. Kings like Hammurabi didn't just consult astrologers, they funded entire schools of sky watchers to decode divine will from planetary movements. A Jupiter sighting might predict a victorious war, while Mars in retrograde could justify delaying taxes. The stars became a political script written in a language only the elite could fluently read and rewrite. Meanwhile, over in Greece, the divine spoke through earthbound channels, the rustling of oak leaves at Dodona, the frenzied murmurs of the Pythia at Delphi. Here, prophecies thrived on human drama enigmas wrapped in ritual, delivered with enough theatrical flair to make them unforgettable. When a Spartan king asked if he should march to war, the oracle didn't point to constellations. It declared, "Either your glorious city will be sacked, or a king of Sparta must die." The ambiguity was the point, By grounding prophecies in local traditions, whether star charts or sacred springs, manipulators ensured they hit cultural pressure points with precision. No one mastered this art of cultural rebranding better than Cyrus the Great. When he marched into Babylon in 539 BCE, he didn't present himself as a foreign conqueror. Instead, his propagandists spun his arrival as the fulfillment of a Babylonian prophecy, one they'd likely helped rediscover. Ancient texts suddenly spoke of a liberator sent by the god Marduk to overthrow the corrupt King Nabonidus. The genius, Cyrus didn't impose his own Persian beliefs. He draped his ambition in Babylonian imagery, making resistance seem like defiance of the gods themselves. Overnight, an invasion became a divine homecoming. This cultural tailoring worked because it exploited something primal, the stories people already told themselves about how the world worked. A prophecy about Nile floods would fall flat in rain-starved Mesopotamia, just as a zodiac-based omen would confuse olive farmers in Greece. The most effective manipulators didn't just speak the language of the gods. They spoke the dialect of the marketplace, the battlefield, the harvest festival. It's why Roman emperors adopted Egyptian titles when ruling the Nile, while Egyptian pharaohs minted coins with Greek gods after Alexander's conquest. Prophecy was the ultimate cross-cultural handshake, flexible enough to sanctify any agenda. Today's echo chambers operate on the same principle. A conspiracy theory that thrives in one community might flop in another, not because it's more or less true, but because it's not packaged for the audience. Modern influencers don't just share information, they frame it in memes, slang, and references that click with specific groups. The parallels are striking. Just as ancient priests used local gods to sell global agendas, today's algorithms use personalized feeds to amplify divisive narratives. The medium has changed, but the manipulation playbook remains timeless, because when you speak someone's spiritual or social language fluently, they'll rarely question who wrote the script. The real power of these tailored prophecies lay in their ability to make oppression feel like destiny. When a Babylonian peasant heard Cyrus was foretold by Marduk, resistance wasn't just futile, it was sacrilege. Customization didn't just increase believability, it weaponized cultural identity against itself. And that's the silent brilliance of the system. The more a prophecy felt homegrown, the less it seemed like a tool of control. After all, who suspects a mirror of being a cage? Augustus didn't just rule Rome, he scripted its destiny with the precision of a playwright. When he seized power after Caesar's assassination, the Republic was in shambles, and legitimacy was his most pressing problem. So he turned to prophecy, specifically the Sibylline books, those ancient scrolls guarded by Rome's elite priests. Suddenly, a long-lost verse surfaced, predicting the arrival of a savior who would usher in a golden age. The timing couldn't have been more convenient. Augustus didn't just embrace this prophecy, he weaponized it, plastering the promise of peace and prosperity across coins, monuments, and official decrees. Everywhere citizens looked, they were reminded, this wasn't just politics, it was fate. Alexander the Great played the same game, but with even bolder strokes. After conquering Egypt, he marched straight to the Oracle of Siwa, where priests confirmed what he'd already declared, that he was the son of Zeus. The oracle's endorsement transformed Alexander from a brilliant general into a living god, silencing critics who might question his authority. Rebellious governors, they weren't just defying a king, they were blaspheming against divinity itself. This was the ultimate power move, prophecy as a crown, woven not from gold but from carefully curated mysticism. Fast forward to modern politics, and you'll spot the same DNA in so-called inevitability narratives. Campaigns love to trumpet polls showing their candidate as the unstoppable choice, or spin economic trends as proof their policies are destined to succeed. Just like Augustus's Golden Age, these claims aren't predictions, they're self-fulfilling propaganda, designed to make opposition seem futile. When a leader declares, "The arc of history bends toward justice," or a party insists their victory is the will of the people, they're speaking in the same coded language ancient rulers used. The message is clear: resistance isn't just wrong, it's unnatural. But the darkest twist in this playbook wasn't just manufacturing consent, it was erasing dissent. In Rome, questioning the Sibylline prophecies wasn't just treason, it was sacrilege. When a senator dared suggest Augustus had fabricated the Golden Age prophecy, he didn't face debate, he faced exile. The gods had spoken, and mortal doubts were heresy. Alexander took it further, executing rivals who refused to bow to his divine status. Prophecy became the ultimate silencer, a trump card that rendered criticism not just unpopular but unholy. Today's echo chambers operate on the same principle. When dissenters are dismissed not just as wrong but as deniers or conspiracists, the tactic is eerily familiar. Social media algorithms amplify voices that align with approved narratives, while marginalizing others as misinformation. The vocabulary has modernized, but the mechanism is ancient. Frame your agenda as the only logical, even moral path, and opposition ceases to be debate, it becomes deviance. The Sibylline priests would have nodded in recognition. What made these tactics so enduring is their psychological grip. Humans crave narratives that promise order in chaos, and rulers from Augustus to modern autocrats exploit that hunger. By draping raw power in the robes of prophecy, they transform force into fate, coercion into cosmic will. The lesson isn't just about history, it's about recognizing when certainty is a performance, and when those who claim to read the future are really writing it. Challenging a prophecy in the ancient world wasn't just debate, it was an act of defiance against the divine order itself. Take the trial of Socrates, framed not just as a philosophical dispute, but as a crackdown on impiety. His real crime, questioning the gods' will as interpreted by Athens' elite. The charges of corrupting the youth and introducing new deities were code for undermining the established narrative. By painting dissent as sacrilege, authorities turned intellectual dissent into a moral contagion, something to be purged for the city's survival. It was a masterstroke of social control. Make skepticism synonymous with sin, and you won't need force to silence critics. The crowd will do it for you. Rome refined this tactic to chilling perfection. The Sibylline books weren't merely consulted, they were legislative sledgehammers. When the Senate faced populist reforms or military dissent, a conveniently discovered prophecy would declare the proposed change an offense to Jupiter. Suddenly, political opponents weren't just wrong, they were endangering Rome's very covenant with the gods. Tiberius Gracchus learned this the hard way when his land reforms were vetoed not with policy arguments, but with omens of divine wrath. The message was clear, the gods had taken sides and debate was over. This playbook thrives today in new guises. Label a scientific theory heresy, and you don't need evidence to discredit it, just moral outrage. Frame political opposition as against the will of the people, and dissent becomes undemocratic by default. The mechanism is identical. Cloak your agenda in unimpeachable virtue, whether divine or ideological, and criticism self-censors. Social media outrage mobs operate like digital priestly castes, where canceling someone mirrors ancient accusations of blasphemy. Both strip legitimacy not through argument, but through exclusion. Yet the most insidious twist was how these systems monetized conformity. Temples didn't just demand obedience, they levied fees for absolution, sold protective amulets against prophesied disasters, and charged admission for salvation rituals. The Oracle of Delphi grew fat on consultation fees from terrified rulers, while Egyptian priests became real estate moguls, trading divine favors for land grants. This wasn't spirituality, it was a protection racket dressed in sacred vestments, and that reveals the ultimate purpose of silencing dissent, not just to control minds but to open wallets. Because when people believe the alternative is damnation, they'll pay anything for redemption. The next time you hear a prophecy, whether from a pulpit, a politician, or a podcast, ask yourself, who profits when questioning becomes a sin? At the height of its power, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi wasn't just a spiritual hub, it was a financial empire. Petitioners didn't walk in empty-handed. They brought goats for sacrifice, silver for the priests, and voluntary donations hefty enough to make the gods blush. A single prophecy could cost the equivalent of a farmer's yearly wages, with priority access granted to kings who funded entire temple expansions. The Pythia's cryptic words came with a price tag, and business was booming. But the real genius was in the ancillary revenue streams: sacred amulets blessed by oracle fumes, cursed tablets for smiting enemies, even bottled water from the Castalian spring marketed as divine elixir. Fear wasn't just a tool of control, it was the backbone of a thriving divine economy. This wasn't unique to Greece. In Egypt, priests sold oracular dreams in the Temple of Serapis, where wealthy patrons paid premium rates to sleep in chambers rigged with hidden sound effects that simulated divine voices. Babylonian astrologers offered subscription services, monthly horoscopes predicting everything from market prices to marital bliss, all for a tidy retainer. The common thread: prophecy became a commodity, packaged and sold to the highest bidder. Even failures were profitable. When a prediction missed its mark, the solution was always another offering, another ritual, another fee to reconcile with the gods. The system was self-sustaining. The more prophecies failed, the more people paid to fix them. Fast forward to today, and the grift wears different robes. Televangelists peddle miracle water at $50 a vial. Instagram psychics demand Venmo payments for spiritual readings. And conspiracy gurus hawk survival gear for doomsday scenarios they themselves predicted. The packaging has gone digital, but the transaction remains unchanged: cash for comfort, money for meaning. What the ancients understood and modern hucksters exploit is that people will empty their pockets for the illusion of certainty. A 2,000-year-old curse tablet and a 21st century blessed crypto wallet serve the same psychological need: the desperate hope that spending can buy safety from chaos. Yet the most insidious profits came from prophecy's role as a geopolitical weapon. When Croesus showered Delphi with gold before attacking Persia, he wasn't just seeking divine favor, he was funding a PR campaign. The oracle's subsequent endorsement of his war wasn't spirituality, it was a paid endorsement, the ancient equivalent of a sponsored post. Cities soon learned the hard way: prophecies favored those who funded the temples. The richer the shrine grew, the more its divine will aligned with the interests of its benefactors. This was no coincidence, it was celestial pay to play. The lesson echoes through history. Whether it's a Babylonian priest claiming Mars demands war or a modern influencer selling preparedness kits for an apocalypse they prophesied, the pattern holds. Prophecy's greatest trick wasn't predicting the future. It was convincing us that safety, victory, and salvation were always just one more payment away. And that's the real curse. The deeper we dig into our pockets, the tighter the chains of belief become. Human brains are wired to seek patterns even when none exist. This primal quirk made ancient prophecies irresistible, like psychological candy for minds craving order in chaos. Consider confirmation bias, that sly trickster of cognition that makes us cling to hits and ignore misses. When the Delphic oracle told Croesus a great empire would fall, he remembered only the empire part, filtering out the ambiguity until Persian swords proved otherwise. Modern experiments reveal identical behavior. Show someone a vague horoscope like, "You'll face a challenge that leads to growth," and they'll recall the work meeting they aced, not the gym session they skipped. The prophecy didn't predict, it mirrored, reflecting back whatever the listener wanted to see. The placebo effect turbocharged this illusion. Just as sugar pills relieve pain if patients believe their medicine, prophecies gained power through expectation alone. Roman generals who consulted omens before battle didn't just get predictions, they got performance enhancers. Troops who believed the gods favored them fought harder, turning faith into self-fulfilling momentum. Studies on sports rituals confirm this. Athletes perform better with lucky charms because belief alters perception of capability. Ancient priests weaponized this, staging miracles like weeping statues to amplify the placebo's grip. Once people witnessed one divine sign, their brains became primed to accept others uncritically, a domino effect of credulity. Cults still use these playbooks today. Compare the Pythia's hallucinogen-fueled trances to modern groups using sleep deprivation and chanting to induce suggestibility. Both exploit the brain's vulnerability in altered states, imprinting ideas that feel divinely implanted rather than human scripted. The unification church's matching ceremonies, where leaders assign spouses based on revelations, mirror how Delphic priests arranged political marriages under the guise of Apollo's will. The mechanisms are twins separated by millennia, manufacture an ecstatic experience, then insert commands disguised as cosmic truth, but the masterstroke was leveraging the sunk cost fallacy. After investing wealth and dignity to consult an oracle, few dared admit they'd been duped. Like gamblers doubling down after losses, societies kept interpreting failed prophecies until they fit. When the Maya prophecy of cyclical apocalypse in 2012 proved false, true believers didn't abandon the calendar, they recalculated its true end date. Cognitive dissonance cemented the deception. The more sacrifices a culture made to prophecies, the harder it became to question them. These psychological traps transformed entire civilizations. The Aztec Empire's collapse began when Moctezuma interpreted Cortés as the returning god Quetzalcoatl, a prophecy likely concocted by rivals. 17th century Japan saw peasant rebellions erupt after astrologers predicted the shogunate's fall, creating the very instability they foretold. In every case, belief didn't just reflect reality, it manufactured it. Because when enough people treat a story as fate, their collective actions bend history to match the fiction. The real magic of prophecy wasn't foreseeing the future. It was building the rails that made society's train run exactly where the engineers wanted. Now imagine applying this lens to today's viral predictions, from AI doomsday scenarios to climate tipping points. The players have new costumes, but the game remains unchanged. Harness innate biases, sprinkle in ambiguity, and let human psychology do the rest. The most potent prophecies were never about truth. They were about trigger Jerusalem burned because its people believed too deeply in their own destruction. In the 1st century, as Roman legions encircled the city, rebel leaders like John of Giscala didn't stockpile food or reinforce walls. They quoted scripture. Ancient texts had foretold a Messiah who would break the yoke of oppression, and so they welcomed the siege as a divine test. The historian Josephus watched in horror as zealots twisted prophecies into weapons, convincing starving crowds that God would send fire from heaven to consume the invaders. When the flames came, they were Roman torches, not divine ones, yet by then, belief had overridden survival instinct. This wasn't faith, it was mass psychosis dressed in sacred verse. The tragedy lies in its predictability. Roman records show Emperor Titus initially hoped to avoid leveling Jerusalem, but the rebels, convinced their apocalyptic prophecies guaranteed victory, refused negotiations, even slaughtering moderates who suggested compromise. Josephus describes how they scoured ancient scrolls for omens, interpreting every eclipse and comet as proof of impending deliverance. When a star seemed to hover over the temple, they took it as a sign to attack, ignoring the reality of Rome's artillery. The parallels to modern doomsday cults are chilling. From the Branch Davidians awaiting the Lamb's wrath in Waco to jihadist groups banking on end times hadiths, the script repeats, absolute certainty becomes a death warrant. Yet prophecies could also be society's glue. Contrast Jerusalem's chaos with the stability of Han China, where court astrologers used celestial forecasts to reinforce order. When a comet appeared, the same omen Judean rebels saw as a battle cry, Chinese chronicles recorded it as a reminder for the emperor to correct his policies. The difference: control. Han rulers monopolized prophecy, punishing unauthorized interpreters while aligning heavenly signs with state agendas. A drought wasn't divine punishment, it was a bureaucratic failure requiring tax relief. This wasn't deception, it was psychological governance, channeling collective anxiety into constructive action rather than rebellion. The lesson echoes through history. When prophecies scatter like wildfire, they burn civilizations to ash. When carefully tended, they can forge unbreakable social contracts. The real power wasn't in the predictions themselves, but in who held the right to interpret them, and whether they wielded that right to unite or divide. Jerusalem's stones still whisper that distinction between prophecy as a mirror for hubris and prophecy as a lamp for collective survival. Augustus didn't just build an empire, he sold it as destiny. At the heart of Rome's golden age stood the Aura Pacis, an altar dripping with symbolism, its marble walls whispering a carefully crafted prophecy. Peace was no accident, but a divine gift bestowed through one man. Every carving told the same story: goddesses cradling fruits, fertile earth yielding abundance, all radiating from Augustus like spokes on a celestial wheel. This wasn't just art, it was a psychological anchor, hammering home the message that rebellion wasn't just treason, but a violation of cosmic order. When local governors grumbled about taxes or legions grew restless, they faced more than imperial wrath, they risked unraveling the very Pax Deorum, the God's covenant of peace. The genius lay in the staging. Annual sacrifices at the altar transformed state propaganda into living ritual, where smoke and chants made manufactured prophecies feel as real as the Tiber's flow. Compare this to Francis Fukuyama's infamous End of History thesis after the Cold War, which declared liberal democracy the final stage of human governance. Like Augustus' priests, Fukuyama framed his ideology not as one option among many, but as an inevitable culmination, a prophecy dressed in academic robes. Both narratives shared the same goal: to make dissent seem irrational, even futile. Why revolt against an emperor when the gods themselves ordained his rule? Why challenge capitalism when history itself proved its supremacy? These weren't arguments, they were thought-terminating clichés designed to shrink the imagination of what's possible. Yet the Pax Romana's real sorcery was how it reshaped identity. Roman coins minted with Augustus' face didn't just signify wealth, they were pocket-sized prophecies, imprinting his divinity onto daily transactions. Provincial children grew up reciting verses about the Saeculum Aureum, the golden age that began with his birth. Over generations, these stories didn't just describe reality, they became reality, as ingrained as the Latin language itself. Modern parallels lurk in every pledge of allegiance: every national anthem tools that don't just celebrate belonging, but manufacture it by conflating the present with eternal truth. The next layer of this manipulation was even subtler, the erasure of alternatives. Augustus didn't just promote his own prophecy, he systematically scrubbed competing narratives from the record. Rival omens were labeled false signs, their interpreters exiled. Temples to older, decentralized gods were absorbed into the imperial cult, their myths rewritten to center Rome. This wasn't just censorship, it was cognitive colonization, ensuring citizens couldn't even conceive of a world beyond the prophecy's frame. Today's algorithm-driven media ecosystems achieve the same end, burying dissenting views under avalanches of approved content until deviation feels unimaginable. What made the Pax Romana endure wasn't military might alone, but this alchemy of prophecy and identity. People will die for many things, but they'll live and labor tirelessly for something they believe is foreordained. Because when a system convinces you it's not just the best option, but the only natural one, resistance feels less like rebellion and more like swimming against the current of time itself. And that's the haunting question left hanging in the Ara Pass's shadow. How much of who we are was written by someone else's script? The Hebrews didn't just survive exile, they rewrote their destiny into a prophecy. When Babylonian conquerors dragged them from Jerusalem in 586 BCE, their priests faced a crisis: how to keep a scattered people from vanishing into history's dust. The answer lay in a radical story, one that transformed trauma into divine promise. Scrolls began circulating with a startling vision that their captivity wasn't defeat but preparation. The God Yahweh, they claimed, would one day lead them back to a land flowing with milk and honey. This wasn't mere comfort, it was identity engineering. By framing displacement as temporary and future return as inevitable, the prophets turned a fractured people into a time bomb waiting to detonate on history's stage. Even the act of documenting their laws and genealogies became sacred resistance, a way to outlast empires by etching their story into eternity. Contrast this with the Greeks, where prophecies didn't unite, they weaponized difference. When the Oracle of Delphi told Sparta its strength lay in isolation, it wasn't offering spiritual guidance, it was fueling Peloponnesian rivalries. Athenian prophecies about naval supremacy didn't celebrate shared Hellenic identity, they justified crushing lesser city-states. Where Hebrew scripture bound tribes together with shared destiny, Greek oracles amplified division, turning neighbor against neighbor in competitions for divine favor. The same Delphic priestess who blessed Athens' wooden walls cursed Thebes with warnings of serpents in the marketplace, a self-fulfilling prophecy that sparked preemptive purges. This duality lives on in modern identity politics. National myths like America's manifest destiny or Zionism's land without a people function like ancient Hebrew prophecies, forging collective purpose through promised futures. Yet conspiracy theories about great replacements or globalist plots mirror Greek divisiveness, carving society into camps of blessed and cursed. The mechanism is identical: prophecy as a crowbar, prying open fissures or welding fragments together depending on who wields it. But the darkest twist emerges when these narratives harden into dogma. Hebrew prophets initially framed return as conditional on moral renewal, a loophole allowing adaptation. Later generations erased the nuance, treating the promised land as an unconditional right. That shift from fluid covenant to rigid entitlement echoes in modern territorial conflicts, where ancient prophecies become legal briefs written in celestial ink. Meanwhile, Greek city-states learned too late that prophecies of eternal supremacy often precede collapse. When your identity depends on divine exceptionalism, admitting weakness isn't just humbling, it's heresy. The line between prophecy and propaganda blurs here. Both require believers to see not what is, but what must be, to view current suffering through the lens of future glory. The Hebrews endured by believing their story wasn't over. The Greeks fractured by believing theirs couldn't be shared, and that's the razor's edge these narratives walk. The same tale that gives one people the strength to survive can give another the audacity to destroy. Nero's ghost was supposed to rise from the dead. At least, that's what his loyalists promised. After the despised emperor's suicide in 68 CE, a cottage industry of prophecies emerged claiming he'd return to punish his enemies and restore Rome's glory. Imposters even pretended to be Nero reborn, rallying followers with claims of divine resurrection. But as years passed and no savior emerged, the disillusionment turned venomous. The very prophecies designed to sustain Nero's cult became proof of its fraudulence, eroding trust not just in his legacy, but in the entire system of imperial divinity. This pattern repeats throughout history. When prophecies fail spectacularly, they don't just fade, they explode in the faces of those who wielded them. The Bar Kokhba rebellion in 132 CE shows how catastrophic this backlash could be. For decades, Jewish rebels had clung to messianic prophecies of a warrior king who'd overthrow Rome. When Simon Bar Kokhba emerged, even the revered Rabbi Akiva declared him the promised Messiah, citing scriptural signs. Coins were minted heralding Israel's redemption, and thousands flocked to Bar Kokhba's banner. But when the revolt collapsed under Roman swords, the fallout was theological as much as military. The rabbinic tradition, desperate to salvage faith, rewrote the narrative. Bar Kokhba wasn't a false messiah, they claimed, but a misunderstood leader. The real lesson: prophecies could rally masses, but when reality shattered the illusion, the resulting vacuum often birthed fiercer dissent. Modern institutions face identical reckoning. Think of political campaigns that promise economic miracles, or corporations predicting can't-miss tech revolutions. When these secular prophecies fail, when factories don't reopen or metaverses don't materialize, the disillusionment doesn't just dissipate. It metastasizes into conspiracy theories, protests, or wholesale rejection of the systems that made the promises. The mechanism mirrors ancient Rome. Elites overplay their hand, treating prophecies as short-term crowd control without considering what happens when the expiration date passes. Yet amid these collapses, one group often held prophetic systems together: women. The Pythia at Delphi, the Sibyls of Rome, the Oracle of Dodona. These weren't anomalies but linchpins. Female prophets provided plausible deniability for male rulers. When a king's gambit failed, he could blame misinterpreted omens from a priestess rather than his own miscalculation. The Sibylline books, Rome's most sacred texts, were allegedly authored by a woman, giving them an air of mystical distance from politics. Even in Jewish tradition, figures like Deborah the judge or Huldah the prophetess served as critical validators of male authority, their perceived purity making their endorsements bulletproof. This gendered division of prophetic labor reveals a deeper truth about manipulation. Women, often barred from direct power, became vessels for convenient truths. Their voices could be amplified when useful and dismissed as hysterical when inconvenient. The pattern persists today, from female whistleblowers being discredited to wellness gurus peddling apolitical escapism. Failed prophecies burn bridges, but the architects rarely stand on them when they collapse. They're too busy finding new prophets or new scapegoats to keep the machine running. Because the greatest trick isn't making people believe in prophecies, it's making sure someone else takes the fall when they crumble. The Pythia at Delphi sat atop her tripod, breathing in volcanic fumes, her wild eyes rolling back as she channeled Apollo's voice. To the pilgrims below, she was a vessel of the divine, but behind the curtain, male priests stood ready to translate her frenzied ramblings into politically convenient decrees. This was the grand illusion of ancient prophecy. Societies that silenced women in public life somehow revered them as mouthpieces of the gods. The trick lay in controlled possession. A woman in a trance wasn't a threat. She was a puppet, her convulsions and garbled words sanitized into authority by the very men who barred her from voting or owning land. The more theatrical her performance, the writhing, the foaming mouth, the easier it was to dismiss her humanity while exploiting her perceived connection to the supernatural. Compare this to the Sibyls, the wandering prophetesses whose books became Rome's most sacred texts. Unlike the Pythia's staged performances, Sibylline prophecies were raw and unscripted, so unsettling that elites couldn't ignore them. The solution: co-opt the danger. By locking the Sibyls' writings in the temple of Jupiter and declaring them state secrets, Roman senators turned radical female insight into a bureaucratic weapon. Need to justify a war? Consult the Sibylline scrolls. Facing a plebeian revolt, suddenly the books demanded grain distribution. The pattern was clear: when women's prophecies served power, they were sanctified. When they challenged it, they were labeled madness. This gendered double standard echoes through modern propaganda. Think of how female whistleblowers are framed as hysterical until their revelations become useful to political opponents, or how grassroots activist movements led by women are dismissed until co-opted by male-dominated institutions. The ancient playbook remains startlingly relevant. Amplify a woman's voice when it's convenient, then weaponize stereotypes to discredit her when it's not. Pythia's vapors have been replaced by viral smear campaigns, but the goal is identical: to keep female insight on a leash, celebrated only when it reinforces existing hierarchies. Yet some women subverted the system entirely. Take the legendary Cassandra, cursed to prophesy truth without being believed. Her myth reveals the ultimate fear of patriarchal systems. What if a woman's unmediated voice was accurate? What if her warnings about Troy's fall or Agamemnon's murder weren't hysterical babble, but clear-eyed analysis? That threat explains why even genuine mystics like the Sibyls had their messages filtered through male interpreters. Unvarnished female foresight was too dangerous. It had to be diluted, edited, or rebranded as divine madness to be palatable. Today's media landscape mirrors this ancient tension. Female experts are often introduced with qualifiers: emotional, controversial, while male counterparts are presumed authoritative. Social media algorithms amplify stereotypically shrill female voices in debates, reinforcing the trope of women as chaotic truth-tellers rather than systematic thinkers. The through line from Delphi to Twitter is unnerving. Wherever prophecy exists, whether as divine pronouncement or data-driven prediction, women's voices are either sanitized or sensationalized, never simply heard. The irony: these manipulations often backfire. Just as Cassandra's ignored prophecies doomed Troy, sidelining female insight has consequences. When Rome's elites cherry-picked Sibylline verses to maintain power, they missed the warnings about imperial overreach that might have saved the Republic. When modern institutions dismiss women's forecasts, from climate scientists to economic analysts, they repeat the cycle. Because the real power of prophecy was never about gender, it was about who gets to control the narrative. And history shows us, silencing half the population doesn't just distort truth, it engineers catastrophe. Now consider how these gender dynamics play out globally, from the state-sponsored visions of medieval European abbesses to the censored trances of African spirit mediums. The next layer of this story isn't just about who speaks, but who listens and who profits when certain prophecies are systematically unheard. Prophecy wasn't just about seeing the future. It was a battlefield where temples and kingdoms clashed with rival visions of destiny. Picture the high priests of Delphi and Dodona locked in a silent war, their oracles issuing contradictory decrees like divine artillery. When Sparta sought guidance for war, Delphi urged caution while Dodona promised victory not because the gods disagreed, but because each temple backed different political factions. The same divine ambiguity that made prophecies so flexible also turned them into weapons, with rival holy sites undermining each other's credibility to sway kings and control the narrative. This wasn't spirituality, it was information warfare draped in sacred vestments. The stakes were even higher in the diplomatic showdowns between Egypt and Mesopotamia. When Pharaoh Amenhotep III received a Babylonian demand for gold, his scribes didn't just refuse, they fired back with an omen. Court astrologers discovered that the stars foretold disaster if Egypt yielded, while simultaneously circulating prophecies in Babylonian client states that warned of revolt if their king pressed the issue. These weren't random celestial observations, they were carefully crafted psychological operations designed to destabilize opponents by weaponizing their own superstitions. The ploy worked so well that Mesopotamian envoys began arriving with their own teams of diviners, turning treaty negotiations into prophecy duels where the real conflict wasn't over land, but over who controlled the narrative of divine will. Fast forward to today, and the tactics feel eerily familiar. Replace temple oracles with state-sponsored media, and you've got modern disinformation campaigns flooding the zone with conflicting truths until no one knows what to believe. Russian bots amplify both sides of a protest. Political operatives leak contradictory polls. The goal isn't to convince, but to paralyze, creating a fog where doubt replaces dissent. The ancients would have recognized the strategy instantly. When you can't control the story, drown it in noise. Yet amid this chaos, a quiet revolution began not in temples, but in observatories. Babylonian astronomers tracking Venus's cycles weren't just seeking omens. They were uncovering patterns that obeyed mathematical laws, not divine whims. Greek philosophers like Thales predicted eclipses without invoking Apollo's wrath. Slowly, the universe shifted from a realm of capricious gods to one of predictable mechanics. When Hipparchus mapped the stars in the 2nd century BCE, he wasn't interpreting celestial messages, he was proving they could be calculated. This was the fatal crack in prophecy's armor. Once people realized nature followed rules, the priests' monopoly on foresight crumbled. Kings still consulted oracles for show, but generals now relied on siege engineers, and merchants trusted tide tables over sacrificial entrails. The real turning point came when societies faced a choice: believe in prophecies that conveniently served the powerful, or trust observations that anyone could verify. The scientific method didn't just offer better predictions, it stripped away the mystery that had made prophecy so profitable. After millennia of divine ambiguity, the future finally began to answer to human reason instead of priestly interpretation. Cicero's quill scratched across parchment like a scalpel dissecting superstition. In his scathing treatise on divination, the Roman statesman didn't just question prophecies, he vivisected them. What madness to think the gods would whisper secrets through goat entrails, he scoffed, pointing out how often rival oracles contradicted each other. His most devastating blow came from simple observation. If prophecies were divine, why did they always align with the political needs of their interpreters? The Delphic priests who foresaw Pompey's victories suddenly found new omens for Caesar after his triumph. Cicero's conclusion was merciless. prophecy wasn't communication with the divine, it was a confidence game dressed in sacred robes. Yet even as skepticism spread, a quiet revolution in Alexandria's libraries was delivering the final blow to prophetic authority. Hellenistic scientists like Eratosthenes weren't just mapping the world, they were proving it operated by predictable laws. When Aristarchus calculated the sun's distance from Earth, he didn't consult the Pythia, he used geometry. This shift from mysticism to methodology changed everything. Farmers no longer needed priests to interpret bird flights for planting seasons. They could consult weather cycles recorded in observatories. Generals stopped sacrificing lambs before battles in favor of studying terrain maps and supply lines. The universe, once a chaotic realm of divine whims, was becoming a clockwork mechanism, and prophecy's gears were grinding to a halt. But like any enduring illusion, prophecy didn't vanish, it shapeshifted. The Sibylline cult survived Rome's rationalist wave by rebranding as keepers of tradition rather than fortune-tellers. Their verses still guided state ceremonies, but now as cultural touchstones rather than divine commands. It was the ancient equivalent of a modern politician quoting the Founding Fathers, less about predicting the future than legitimizing present actions through nostalgic reverence. Even Cicero, the great debunker, grudgingly accepted the Sibylline books as useful fictions for maintaining social order, a telling admission that some illusions are too politically valuable to dismantle. The parallels to today's information wars are impossible to ignore. Just as Hellenistic astronomers exposed prophecy's flaws through empirical evidence, modern fact-checkers dismantle viral misinformation with data. Yet, like the Sibylline cults, conspiracy theories adapt rather than die. QAnon didn't fade after its Great Awakening failed to materialize. It metastasized into smaller, self-correcting factions. Climate change deniers no longer argue about temperature graphs. They pivot to economic responsibility narratives. The playbook is ancient. When evidence undermines your prophecy, shift the goalposts or reframe the stakes. What ultimately doomed classical prophecy wasn't just skepticism, but something more profound: the democratization of knowledge. Once the Library of Alexandria made celestial charts and medical texts available to any scholar, the monopoly of priests and oracles collapsed. Today's equivalent might be Wikipedia or satellite imagery tools that put verification power in everyone's hands. Yet human psychology remains the wild card. We may have traded sacrificial altars for smartphones, but our craving for certainty in an uncertain world still leaves room for modern-day oracles. The real lesson from antiquity isn't that prophecy died, it's that it learned to thrive in the gaps between what we know and what we desperately wish were true. The algorithms scrolling across your screen today don't breathe hallucinogenic vapors or chant in smoke-filled temples, but they're running the same ancient playbook. Just as Delphic priests curated prophecies to serve elite interests, modern platforms tailor your digital omens through eerily precise predictions. That uncanny ad for shoes you merely glanced at, the political headline amplifying your deepest fears. These aren't coincidences, they're algorithmic divination, using your data like sacrificial entrails to forecast and manipulate your next move. The medium has shifted from stone tablets to smartphones, but the goal remains unchanged: shape behavior by weaponizing certainty. Political messiahs still cloak ambition in destiny's robes too. Mussolini didn't just promise to rebuild Italy, he invoked the Roman prophecy of a reborn empire. Hitler's Third Reich wasn't framed as policy, it was spun as Teutonic myth, a 1,000-year destiny written in runes and Wagnerian opera. Today's strongmen borrow the same script, whether it's Putin posing as the second coming of Byzantine emperors or fringe movements peddling Great Awakening fantasies. The details change, but the narcotic appeal remains. Surrender your agency to the inevitable and let history's chosen ones do the thinking. What makes these tactics so enduring isn't just cunning, it's biology. Our brains crave patterns like lungs crave oxygen, a holdover from when mistaking rustling grass for a predator kept us alive. This neural glitch explains why conspiracy theories spread faster than facts. They transform chaos into cause and effect narratives, offering the illusion of control. Ancient priests exploited this by attributing plagues to divine wrath instead of germs. Modern grifters do the same by blaming economic woes on shadowy cabals rather than complex systems. The wiring hasn't evolved, only the delivery method. Spotting engineered prophecies today requires questioning the inevitable. When a leader claims their victory is destined, ask who wrote that destiny. When an algorithm insists you'll love this product, interrogate the data priesthood behind the curtain. The red flags mirror antiquity, vagueness dressed as profundity, fear masquerading as foresight, and outcomes suspiciously convenient for those peddling them. True foresight empowers, prophetic manipulation demands obedience. The antidote lies in embracing uncertainty, not as weakness but as wisdom. Ancient skeptics like Cicero thrived by demanding evidence over edicts. Today's equivalent, verify before sharing, seek counter-narratives. Remember, every divine algorithm was coded by human hands, because the most dangerous prophecy isn't the one that fails, it's the one we never think to challenge. Spotting modern prophecies begins with recognizing the same fingerprints ancient priests left on their oracles: vagueness dressed as wisdom, fear disguised as foresight. Take QAnon's infamous The Storm prophecy, a narrative claiming a single day would bring mass arrests of elites and societal redemption. Like Delphi's riddles, it was elastic enough to stretch across years of failed deadlines, with followers dismissing misses as misinterpretations rather than falsehoods. The parallels to Croesus's doomed river crossing are uncanny. Both prophecies hinged on ambiguous phrasing that could be retrofitted to any outcome. Modern manipulators have simply swapped sacred caves for encrypted forums, where gurus spin conspiracy theories with the same calculated opacity that once dripped from the Pythia's lips. Climate doom mongering reveals another ancient tactic, the selective highlight reel. Just as Roman priests curated only accurate omens while burying misses, today's fear peddlers amplify worst-case climate scenarios while ignoring nuanced data. A headline screaming, "Oceans will be empty by 2048, taps into the same primal panic as an oracle warning of God's wrath upon the harvest. Both exploit our brain's negativity bias, the tendency to prioritize dire predictions over balanced probabilities. The key giveaway, when projections lack clear timelines or caveats, mirroring the Sibylline book's vagueness about which generation would face prophesied disasters. Watch too for the divine authority swap, the modern equivalent of priests claiming Apollo's endorsement. Influencers today don't cite Zeus, they invoke the science or the algorithm, treating these concepts as monolithic oracles rather than evolving human constructs. A tweet declaring, "Experts predict economic collapse," borrows Delphi's playbook. It strips context, omits dissenting voices, and presents a unified narrative as indisputable. Real science, like ancient astronomy, thrives on debate and correction. Prophecy masquerading as science demands uncritical acceptance. The most insidious modern prophecies cloak themselves in inevitability. History shows socialism always fails, or capitalism is the end stage of human development, aren't analyzes. They're secular doomsday scrolls designed to shut down debate by framing one path as preordained. Augustus would applaud the tactic. His Golden Age propaganda made imperial rule seem as natural as sunrise. Today's version might be Silicon Valley's tech utopia narratives, where billionaires pose as prophets of an inescapable AI-driven future. The red flag when alternatives are dismissed not with evidence but with the equivalent of "the gods have spoken." Why do these patterns persist across millennia? Because human psychology hasn't upgraded since Babylon. Our brains still crave the dopamine hit of certainty in an uncertain world, whether delivered by a trembling priestess or a viral tweet. The true defense isn't dismissing all predictions, it's spotting the difference between forecasts that empower and prophecies that enslave. Ancient skepticism flourished when people asked, "Who benefits?" As the incense swirled, today's antidote is the same: follow the money, the power, and the fear, because the oldest prophecy of all is that those who control the story will always claim it was written by someone or something greater than themselves. The rest is commentary.